You've heard of the Black Death, the plague that killed millions across medieval Europe in a symphony of boils, fever, and agony. You've probably learned about the Spanish flu that swept the globe after World War I, claiming more lives than the war itself. But what about the plague that forced you to dance until your heart literally exploded in your chest? In July 1518, in the prosperous city of Strasbourg, something began that defies everything we think we know about disease, madness, and human behavior. It started with a single woman stepping into a narrow cobblestone street and beginning to dance. Not the joyful dancing of a festival or celebration, but a frantic, compulsive, terrifying dance that she could not stop. Her feet moved against her will, her body twisted and jerked in rhythms that had nothing to do with music, and her eyes held the wide, desperate look of someone trapped in their own flesh. Within days, dozens had joined her involuntary marathon. Within weeks, hundreds of people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg, their bodies moving in endless, exhausting motion while their minds screamed for rest. They danced through blistering summer heat, through thunderstorms, through the night and into dawn. They danced until their feet bled through their shoes, until their hearts gave out, until they collapsed dead in the very streets where they had been unable to stop moving. This wasn't madness as we typically understand it. This wasn't a religious ecstasy or a drunken celebration gone wrong. This was the dancing plague of 1518, one of history's most bizarre and terrifying examples of mass hysteria, where an entire community's collective mind shattered under pressures we're only beginning to understand. The authorities didn't try to stop it. They built stages and hired musicians, believing that more dancing was the cure. They were spectacularly, tragically wrong. Today, we're going to walk through those cobblestone streets and witness one of humanity's strangest disasters. A plague that attacked not the body, but the mind, and left an entire city dancing on the edge of madness and death. To understand how an entire city could literally dance itself to death, we must first understand the world that created this nightmare. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city balanced on a knife's edge between prosperity and catastrophe. Officially part of the Holy Roman Empire, but effectively independent, it had grown wealthy through trade along the Rhine River. Its Gothic cathedral spired toward heaven, its markets bustled with merchants from across Europe, and its burghers lived in comfortable, half-timbered houses that spoke of success and stability. But beneath this veneer of prosperity, Strasbourg was a city under siege by invisible enemies. The previous decade had brought a series of brutal harvests, each winter hungrier than the last. Ergot-infected grain had poisoned whole families, causing hallucinations, convulsions, and agonizing deaths. Syphilis, that new and terrifying disease, had arrived from the New World and was spreading through the population like wildfire. Smallpox, typhoid, and the sweating sickness claimed lives with ruthless efficiency, while the ever-present threat of plague hung over every gathering, every market day, every shared meal. The social fabric of the city was fraying under these pressures. Traditional hierarchies were breaking down as death claimed nobles and peasants alike. The church, supposedly the source of comfort and guidance, offered only dire warnings about God's wrath and the approaching end times. Street preachers declared that these disasters were divine punishment for humanity's sins, while apocalyptic pamphlets circulated through the markets filled with graphic descriptions of the torments awaiting the wicked. In this atmosphere of desperation and dread, the people of Strasbourg had begun to believe in darker forces. Folk tales of dancing manias had circulated through the region for generations, stories of Saint Vitus and his curse that could force people to dance until they died. These weren't mere superstitions, they were part of a complex belief system that attributed mysterious illnesses to supernatural causes. When crops failed or children died inexplicably, communities looked for signs of witchcraft, demonic possession, or divine wrath. The medical understanding of the time made these supernatural explanations seem perfectly reasonable. Physicians trained in the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates believed that illness resulted from imbalances in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Mental disturbances were attributed to an excess of melancholy or corrupted blood. Treatment involved bloodletting, purging, and attempts to restore balance through diet and herbal remedies. The idea that dozens of people could simultaneously develop the same compulsive behavior was beyond their comprehension. Into this powder keg of social anxiety, religious terror, and medical ignorance stepped Frau Trophäa on that fateful day in July. Historical records don't tell us much about her. She appears to have been a middle-class woman, possibly a widow, living in one of Strasbourg's residential neighborhoods. What we do know is that something in her mind snapped with such spectacular force that it would drag an entire city into madness with her. The city's governance structure, a complex web of guild representatives and noble appointees, was utterly unprepared for what was about to unfold. They had procedures for dealing with plague outbreaks, food riots, and foreign invasions. They had no protocol for handling hundreds of their citizens dancing themselves to death in the public squares. Their response would prove not just inadequate, but catastrophically wrong, turning a local outbreak of hysteria into a full-scale epidemic of compulsive movement. The morning of July 14, 1518, began like any other summer day in Strasbourg. The narrow streets between the half-timbered houses were already warming under the climbing sun, filled with the familiar sounds of a medieval city awakening. Church bells marking the hour, the clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones, the calls of vendors setting up their stalls in the market squares. The air carried the mingled scents of fresh bread from the bakers, horse dung from the streets, and the ever-present smell of wood smoke from countless hearths and workshops. Frau Trophäa emerged from her house into this ordinary morning and began to dance. Not the measured steps of a court dance or the exuberant leaps of a village celebration, but a strange, jerky movement that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her body, beyond her conscious control. Her neighbors later described her movements as violent and ceaseless, her arms flailing in patterns that followed no earthly music, her feet stamping against the stones with a rhythm that seemed to echo from hell itself. The first witnesses gathered slowly, drawn by the spectacle of a respectable woman behaving so strangely in broad daylight. In the rigid social hierarchy of 16th century Strasbourg, public displays of emotion or unusual behavior were deeply shameful. Women especially were expected to maintain perfect decorum in public spaces. Yet, here was Frau Trophäa, her hair coming loose from its proper covering, sweat streaming down her face, her breath coming in ragged gasps as her body moved in ways that defied explanation. As the hours passed, her dancing grew more frantic rather than less. Her feet began to bleed as they struck the rough cobblestones again and again, but still she could not stop. Her eyes took on a glassy, distant quality, as if she were seeing something the growing crowd of onlookers could not perceive. When concerned neighbors tried to approach her to lead her home or offer water, she seemed unable to hear them. Her world had narrowed to the compulsive movement that had seized control of her limbs. By afternoon, the authorities had been summoned. The city's physicians examined her as she danced, noting her rapid pulse, her labored breathing, and the strange rigidity in her movements. They declared it a case of hot blood, recommending that she be allowed to continue dancing until the fever burned itself out. This medical advice, based on centuries of classical theory, would prove to be spectacularly wrong. Instead of curing Frau Trophäa, it legitimized her behavior and created the conditions for catastrophe. The second day brought more dancers. A baker's wife began moving her arms in the same jerky patterns while kneading her dough, then abandoned her work entirely to dance beside Frau Trophäa in the street. A young man leaving church service felt his legs begin to move against his will, carrying him in strange, looping patterns around the cathedral square. By evening, nearly a dozen people were dancing continuously, their movements becoming synchronized in ways that defied coincidence. The sound of all these bodies moving together created an eerie percussion that echoed off the stone walls of the surrounding buildings. The slap of bare feet against cobblestones, the rustle of clothing in constant motion, the labored breathing of exhausted dancers. It all combined into a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the very streets of Strasbourg. Some witnesses later claimed they could feel the ground itself vibrating under the weight of so many dancing feet. As word spread throughout the city, crowds gathered to watch this unprecedented spectacle. The marketplaces emptied as vendors abandoned their stalls to witness the growing mass of dancers. Children pressed against windows to stare at the strange procession moving through their familiar streets. The smell of fear began to mingle with the summer air, the sharp scent of sweat and panic as parents clutched their children closer, wondering if this madness might be contagious. By the end of the first week, over 30 people were dancing without rest. They had stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped acknowledging the world around them, except for the driving compulsion that kept their bodies in constant motion. Their clothes hung in tatters, their hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and their eyes had taken on the hollow, desperate look of people trapped in a nightmare from which they could not wake. The city's response revealed the complete inadequacy of medieval medical and governmental systems when faced with mass psychological phenomena. Rather than recognizing the outbreak as a form of collective hysteria, the authorities doubled down on their initial diagnosis. They hired professional musicians and built a wooden stage in the cathedral square, believing that proper music would help the dancers achieve the rhythm they needed to cure themselves. The musicians, drummers, pipers, and string players, summoned from across the region, began playing in shifts to provide continuous accompaniment for the growing army of dancers. The music was meant to be therapeutic, but its effect was precisely the opposite. The rhythmic beats seemed to drive the dancers to even more frantic movement, their bodies responding to the external rhythm while their minds remained trapped in private hells. The stage quickly became stained with blood from the dancers' torn feet. City workers were assigned to mop it clean several times daily, but the red stains kept reappearing as fresh dancers mounted the platform and began their endless, destructive performances. The wooden boards began to sag and crack under the constant pounding of desperate feet, creating an ominous creaking that could be heard throughout the square. As July turned to August, the death toll began to mount. The first victims collapsed from heart failure, their exhausted organs simply unable to sustain the relentless physical demands of continuous dancing. Others died from strokes, brought on by dehydration and the extreme physical stress of their compulsive movements. The city's records, kept with typical medieval precision, noted each death with clinical detachment. Died while dancing, succumbed to the dancing fever, heart gave out during the dance. The smell of death began to permeate the areas where the dancing was concentrated. Bodies were removed quickly to prevent the spread of disease, but the psychological impact of seeing neighbors, friends, and family members literally dance themselves to death created a new wave of terror that rippled through the city. Parents forbade their children from going near the dancing areas. Shops closed their doors when the dancers approached, and entire neighborhoods began to feel like they were under siege by an invisible enemy. Yet still the dancing continued, and still more people joined the deadly marathon. The compulsion seemed to spread through observation, as if watching the dancers for too long could somehow transfer their affliction to new victims. City officials began posting guards to prevent crowds from gathering, but curiosity and horror drew people to witness this unprecedented disaster despite the obvious dangers. The medical establishment, faced with a phenomenon that challenged everything they understood about human behavior and disease, began proposing increasingly desperate treatments. Some physicians recommended bloodletting to cool the dancers' heated blood. Others prescribed herbal concoctions meant to restore balance to disrupted humors. A few suggested exorcism, believing the dancers had been possessed by demons or cursed by witches. None of these treatments had any effect. The dancers continued their relentless movement, their bodies growing thinner and weaker, even as their compulsion remained as strong as ever. The sight of dozens of emaciated figures moving in synchronized patterns through the city streets created an apocalyptic atmosphere that convinced many residents that the end times had finally arrived. The dancing plague of 1518 finally began to subside only when the authorities abandoned their catastrophic medical treatment and instead turned to religious intervention. By late August, with dozens dead and hundreds still trapped in their compulsive dancing, the city council authorized a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Vitus at Hohenstein. The dancers were loaded onto carts, still moving, even while lying down, and transported to the rural shrine where prayers were offered for their recovery. Remarkably, the change of location seemed to break the spell for many victims. Away from the crowds, the music, and the urban environment where their hysteria had first manifested, people began to regain control of their bodies. The dancing gradually slowed, then stopped altogether, leaving exhausted survivors to contemplate the nightmare they had just endured. Modern medical analysis suggests that this recovery was aided by the removal of environmental triggers that had been sustaining the mass hysteria. The true horror of the dancing plague becomes clear when we understand it not as a supernatural curse, but as a mass psychogenic illness, a collective mental breakdown triggered by the extreme psychological pressures facing Strasbourg's population. The city was experiencing what modern psychologists would recognize as a perfect storm of conditions for mass hysteria. Social upheaval, economic uncertainty, widespread malnutrition, religious anxiety, and a cultural belief system that made compulsive dancing seem like a plausible supernatural punishment. The initial trigger was likely Frau Trofea's individual psychological crisis, possibly brought on by personal trauma exacerbated by the broader social stresses affecting the community. Her public breakdown provided a template for others experiencing similar psychological pressures, creating a contagion of behavior that spread through suggestion and social reinforcement. The authorities' decision to encourage more dancing transformed a manageable outbreak into a full-scale epidemic. This wasn't the only dancing mania in medieval Europe. Similar outbreaks occurred across the Germanic regions throughout the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, always in communities experiencing severe social stress. The common factors included famine, disease, social upheaval, and strong cultural beliefs in supernatural causation. The Strasbourg outbreak was merely the largest and best documented example of a recurring phenomenon that revealed deep truths about human psychology under extreme pressure. The medical establishment's response exposed the dangerous gap between their confidence and their actual understanding of human behavior. By treating the dancing as a physical ailment requiring physical cure, they inadvertently created conditions that sustained and spread the hysteria. Their prescription of more dancing was like throwing gasoline on a fire, demonstrating how expert authority can become part of the problem when it lacks accurate knowledge. The long-term consequences for survivors were severe and lasting. Many suffered permanent physical damage from weeks of continuous movement, damaged joints, heart problems, and chronic pain that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The psychological trauma was equally profound as survivors struggled to understand what had happened to them and why they had been unable to control their own bodies during the crisis. Perhaps most significantly, the dancing plague revealed the terrifying fragility of social order when collective psychology breaks down. In just a few weeks, a prosperous medieval city had descended into chaos as hundreds of its citizens became trapped in behavior they could not control. The episode demonstrated that even seemingly stable communities could be pushed beyond their breaking point by the right combination of stressors. The dancing plague of 1518 stands as one of history's most chilling reminders that the human mind, for all its remarkable capabilities, remains vulnerable to forces we barely understand. What happened in Strasbourg wasn't the result of supernatural curses or divine wrath. It was the product of a society pushed beyond its psychological breaking point, where individual trauma became collective nightmare through the mysterious mechanisms of mass hysteria. The tragedy of those summer months reveals something profound about the relationship between social stress and mental health. The people of Strasbourg weren't weak or foolish. They were human beings trying to survive in a world that had become almost unbearably difficult. When their individual coping mechanisms failed, their collective mind fractured in ways that transformed personal anguish into public catastrophe. This medieval disaster carries urgent relevance for our modern world, where social media can spread psychological contagion at unprecedented speed and scale. We've seen echoes of Strasbourg in everything from mass fainting episodes at schools to viral challenges that compel dangerous behavior. The fundamental mechanisms that drove people to dance themselves to death 5 centuries ago still operate in human psychology today. The dancing plague ultimately teaches us that civilization's veneer is thinner than we like to believe. Beneath our rational systems and expert authorities lies the same vulnerable human psychology that can transform individual suffering into collective madness under the right conditions. The cobblestone streets of Strasbourg still remember the sound of hundreds of feet moving in desperate, deadly rhythm, a reminder that sometimes the greatest plagues are those that attack not our bodies, but our minds.